I usually hold off on doing playoff videos until I've seen enough from every team, and between injuries and a bunch of teams that we just kind of figured out at this point, I've seen enough to do some playoff rankings. So today we're going to go through the top 12 defense rankings for the fantasy football playoffs in 2025 fantasy football. And I'm one of the only creators who covers defense multiple times a week. So make sure to go down there, drop a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Now, getting into our first tier, I feel really good about this first tier of defenses for a couple of reasons. I've got the Seahawks defense at number 1 and the Texans defense at number 2 to round out this very exclusive tier. Now, I was talking to a buddy last night, and he, like me, appreciates good fantasy defense and just good NFL defenses. And we both agreed there's 3 defenses in the NFL this year that are absolutely phenomenally talented and well schemed and just super physical. The Seahawks defense, the Texans defense, and the Broncos defense. With the Seahawks defense, they've got such a good thing going for them. And you saw it last night against the Washington Commanders. I mean, they literally broke Jaden Daniels' arm, which was not fun to watch. But the Seahawks defense, they are good from top to bottom. Aggressive, physicality. That's one of the reasons they're one of the top 2 defenses in fantasy. 27 sacks through 8 games, 9 interceptions, a forced fumble. They've also got special teams touchdowns, and with Torrey Horton back there returning punts, that guy is always a threat to score. Now, I think the big thing with the Seahawks defense is I've got some matchups in here that I think could go their way in the playoffs. So they play against Indianapolis at home the first week of the playoffs, then they play against the Rams at home in week 16, and then they go to Carolina in week 17. So I want to start with this Colts matchup right here, because if you did not watch the Steelers and Colts yesterday, I watched Daniel Jones morph into his Giants version like he was a freaking werewolf. He absolutely started to look exactly like that guy, throwing guys right into a defender or throwing the ball right into a defender's hands. It was ugly. So I've seen that Daniel Jones can look like that guy again, and it's at home in Seattle. That's one of the toughest places to play. I don't think that's a terrible matchup on the surface, as it might look. Versus the Los Angeles Rams, that's a divisional matchup. And divisional matchups, particularly at the end of the year, they can get really weird. And it's at home. And then you go to Carolina, and I get it. Carolina's been kind of a surprise team here and there, but they're still not putting up a ton of points. I trust the Seahawks defense to be able to stop them and be a top-tier defense for the fantasy playoffs. And then at number 2, the Texans defense. They've got an even better situation as far as schedule goes, but I see a little bit more problems with them than I do with Seattle. And first of all, from a talent perspective, they're extraordinarily talented. They're super physical, they're mean, they're fast, they're aggressive. 17 sacks through the first 8 games, 9 interceptions, 4 fumble recoveries. This is an aggressive defense top to bottom. They've got playmakers on every positional unit in that defensive front. Now, I think the Texans' schedule is arguably potentially better than the Seahawks' defensive schedule. They got Arizona at home in week 15, then they get the Raiders at home in week 16, and then they go to the Los Angeles Chargers in week 17. So there's a couple different things going on here. Number 1, I value the championship matchup more than I do in week 15 and 16, because you want to make sure you have a lock in week 17, that championship matchup. And to me, the Panthers matchup for the Seahawks is more of a lock than the Chargers matchup. That's a tough matchup. We can all agree on that. But the first 2, obviously, those are tremendous matchups, better than the Seahawks have. Versus Arizona, versus the Las Vegas Raiders in Houston, that's a matchup I want in on. I think my problem here is that the Texans season may be over and done with if the Colts don't go on a losing streak, because the Texans themselves are a 5-loss team right now. So I do worry about that from a playability perspective late in the season. If you've got a team that season is truly over, they become less likely to perform in fantasy football, particularly on the defensive side. So there is that level of concern, but not concerning enough to keep them outside of the top 2 and outside of tier 1. Dropping down to our next tier, I've got the Steelers defense at number 3. And let me tell you something. I have been at the front lines of saying the Steelers defense is super overrated for years. Not just this year, for years. And for the most part, I've been proven very right. However, I did come on here and say on Friday when I went through every defense and every matchup for week 9, and I said, I think the Steelers defense will surprise some people this weekend. This is a defense that can cause turnovers, and by God, they made Daniel Jones look like the Giants version of himself. And they shut down Jonathan Taylor. Like, that defense still can put up good games when they want to. Now, here's the thing. I think their schedule these last couple of games is pretty good. They play Miami at home. Now, here's the thing about that on week 15. In Pittsburgh, that's a good matchup for the Steelers versus the Miami Dolphins, because I've said this a couple times over the weeks. With the Dolphins, if you get them out of their element, they're already not a good team. We have acknowledged that. But if you get them out of their element, which is either at home in their own weather, or if you get them in a dome game, those two situations, they'll put up points. But if you get them out of their element and in the cold weather, that's when the Dolphins completely shut down. And that's why I think that's a fantastic Week 15 matchup. Then in Detroit, there's no secret here. That is a matchup you want to avoid the Steelers defense. But I would put them on the bench that particular week, grab a different defense for that week, and then continue to play the Steelers in Week 17 if you make it to the championship, because they go to Cleveland to play the Browns, who are inept offensively with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback. Now, who's to say by that time we don't see Shedeur Sanders or somebody else? I think that's possible, but I do think that Cleveland is just either way not in a good situation, particularly at the end of the year when all their players have already said 1, 2, 3, Cancun. Let's get the hell out of here. Let's get on a vacation. I think that's very possible. So I think the Steelers defense, they proved to a lot of people that said they were terrible, and I get it. I was on board saying they're terrible, but I did also acknowledge this is a defense that still can make plays necessary for fantasy production. And what did they do this past week? They got 6 turnovers off the Colts, the most efficient offense in the NFL, and now their total is up to 27 sacks, 8 forced fumbles, 8 fumble recoveries, and 8 interceptions. They can still put up points. Number 4, I've got the Saints defense coming out of absolutely freaking nowhere. So if you look at the Saints defense and their numbers this year, obviously nothing is too incredible, but I will say they've actually had some hidden gem moments this year with 19 sacks, 4 interceptions, 8 forced fumbles, and 6 fumble recoveries. They've also had a game against the Giants where they had 18 fantasy points. They had 8 points in week 1 versus Arizona. They had 6 points against the Tampa Bay Bucks. Like, they've actually had some bright spot moments. Now, I want to highlight a couple of different things here before I get into their schedule, which is the reason they're in the top 5. The New Orleans Saints, if you look at their good games, well, one of those came against a divisional opponent, the Tampa Bay Bucks. And that's what I always say. Divisional matchups can get very, very weird, particularly at the end of the season. So now let's look at their unbelievably great schedule versus Carolina, versus the Jets, and at Tennessee. That doesn't get much better. I mean, it's from every positional standpoint. You're not going to play a good offense in there. Again, the best is Carolina. And Carolina's not going to put up more than 20, 24 points on the Saints defense. That's just not going to happen. They're not that good. And again, divisional matchup, things get weird. Then they play the Jets at home. And the Jets offense, I don't care what they look like by then, nothing can solve dysfunction. And that's where the Jets are at. And then you go to Tennessee, that's your one away game. Are you kidding me? Like, I don't know how to not put the Saints inside the top 5 with this level of schedule that they have. It's really plain and simple. That's the reason they're here. The Bucs defense is at number 5. Now, here's the thing about the Bucs before we get into their schedule. They've actually done low-key well in fantasy this year. They're the number 6 defense in fantasy football right now with 25 sacks through 8 games, 7 interceptions, 6 forced fumbles, and 5 fumble recoveries with a safety and 2 defensive touchdowns. They have big play moments, much like a Todd Bowles defense does. He's a bend but don't break defensive type of coordinator. That's what Todd Bowles has done, and he's had good games. 26-point day against the Saints. Obviously, that's a great matchup. But against the Lions, of all teams, 8 points in a game where they got crushed because they made plays. They got after Jared Goff 4 different times. That's the key to fantasy defenses. You get big plays. I don't care how bad you lose by, you can make some points happen. But of course, the Bucs get some major breaks here. They get to play the Falcons at home, which is, again, a divisional matchup, and the Falcons are one of the most inconsistent teams in the NFL. So they may come in and just hammer the Bucs with points in this game, or they might come in and do nothing. I'm willing to play them in that matchup alone. Then they go to Carolina, another divisional matchup I would trust the Bucs defense in more than I would trust the Panthers offense in. And then they go to Miami in week 17. By that time, weather doesn't matter. I get it, Miami gets in their own element. By that time, weather doesn't matter. We know Mike McDaniel will get fired at the end of the year, and their players are already on a mental vacation. They don't care anymore. I want that matchup for sure. So with those three matchups, and with the Bucs defense and how well they've done this year, I think it's a really good situation for the Bucs. And then the Eagles defense is at number 6 to round out this tier right here. And the Eagles defense, there's a couple different things at play here. So number one, from a fantasy football perspective, this has been a problem for the Eagles over the past several years. They have a much better NFL defense than they do a fantasy defense. Like if you look at the Eagles through 8 games, they're averaging 2 sacks per game. That's not that great. So they have 16 sacks through 8 games. That's a major reason why they went on the trade market. And just this morning, as of the time of this filming, they went ahead and bought Jalen Phillips from the Miami Dolphins for a 3rd round pick. He can rush the passer, and now all of a sudden, that guy's on a team that can make it to a championship and get him a Super Bowl ring from one night to the next. So I think that's a really good addition to their team. They've also made back-end moves to get some secondary help in that defense as well. So I think that interception number will go up from 5 and probably go up to about 10 by the end of the season, or maybe even 15. They have had success in some games in fantasy football, but they have not nearly been consistent enough to play them and rely on them. 13-point game against the Rams in week 3, 14-point game against the Bucs in week 4, and a 12-point game against the Vikings in week 7. Those have really been their only games where they've been playable because they've had a lot of stinkers in between. But I do think that with their schedule heading into the playoffs, there's some moments here where I think they're going to have tons of success. So they play the Raiders at home the first week. That's an already lock matchup. You get that defense for your first week of the fantasy playoffs. Then they play the Commanders. And of course, that would have been a different story had they had Jaden Daniels. But Jaden Daniels, in all likelihood, without knowing how long exactly he's going to be out, if you watched the game last night, you saw his arm literally snap. Then you don't think that he's going to play in this game versus the Eagles, where at that point in the season, the Commanders' season will be done. And then they play the Bills at Buffalo in week 17. You get off them for that matchup. But those first 2 games, those could take you to championship runs. And then you just go with a different team in the championship game. I think the Eagles defense is a very good one, particularly for the first 2 weeks of the playoffs. And here's where the waiver wire gets super important, guys. In the fantasy football playoffs, you want to make sure that you secure your top fantasy defenses and fantasy kickers on the waiver wire ahead of time. Well, you've never been able to do that until now. Our automatic waiver system, it's not just about the automation process. First of all, when you do that, there's always a mad dash at 3 in the morning to get your waiver wire claims after the priority waiver claims run for free agents that are free on the wire. Well, our system has automated that process, so you don't have to wake up and beat the crowd at 3 a.m. to get the defense or the kicker you want after priority waiver claims run through. Then we've automated that process. That's part of it. But the other part of it is you can schedule out these pickups weeks and even months in advance. You could go to the Eagles defense right now and schedule out a claim for like December 1st or December 2nd. That's the beauty of our tool right here. And you need to jump on this because it's $6 a month for a league-winning tool by itself. And on top of that, you get access to my top 250 rankings on a weekly basis. You also get access to the comparison feature and the league sync-up feature, all for $6 a month. League-winning tools for $6 a month. You need to get in on this price before the fantasy football playoffs. Now, going down to our next tier right here, I've got the Broncos defense at number 7. Now, obviously, what needs to be covered is, I said earlier in the video, I think the Broncos defense is one of the elites in the league. I think they're right up there with the Texans defense and the Seahawks defense. They just get a little hosed with their playoff schedule. But the way I think about the Broncos is exactly how I would have thought about the Seahawks or the Texans defense. Regardless of schedule, they will be a good defense to play in the fantasy playoffs because I don't think that they're going to bust in any of these games. They're too good. The Denver defense has 40 sacks through the first 9 games. That's more than 4 sacks per game on average. That's fantastic. And that alone is getting them fantasy production. They have 4 interceptions through the first 9 games and 4 forced fumbles. Their front 7 is dominant, and they've got a great safety, Talanoa Hufanga, who basically plays like Troy Polamalu did in his heyday. Not saying he's Troy. I love Troy, but Talanoa Hufanga gets trained by Troy. This guy is a fantastic athlete. And I do think that the Broncos defense, again, if you factor in the schedule, you have to put them this low. And so they get the Green Bay Packers at home in Denver in Week 15, which could be a low-key, sneaky matchup if the Packers continue to stumble throughout the season. That offense, for some reason, they don't know what their real identity is as a team, and I don't know if they'll figure it out by then. Hopefully they would, in theory, for fantasy purposes, but for fantasy defense purposes, it'd be great if the Broncos had a good one in their very sneaky matchup potentially. Then they get the Jags at home. That, to me, is a lock. I think the Jags offense, I've seen enough. They're not good enough. I don't trust Trevor Lawrence, and I do think that with Brian Thomas Jr. struggles, they don't have enough firepower on that offense. That, to me, in Denver, that's a lock matchup. And then at Kansas City. Obviously, you probably want to stray away from that type of matchup right there. But I do think the playoff success of the Broncos' entirety, it hinges on that Green Bay matchup. And I think it could be a good one or it could be a really ugly one. But I do think, again, the Broncos defense is too good. Even if they're losing 2 out of 3 of these games. Let's say they lose to both Green Bay and Kansas City. They're going to put up fantasy production. If for nothing else, because they'll get after your quarterback. No team has been able to stop it, and I don't think that any of these 3 teams will be able to stop it either. The Patriots defense is a number 8. Now, we're talking about the number 1 defense in fantasy football right now through 9 games. This team has done very well from a defensive perspective. 20 sacks through 9 games, 7 interceptions, 4 fumble recoveries, and 5 forced fumbles with a defensive touchdown, a safety, and 2 special teams touchdowns. What you can see, all those numbers indicate great coaching. Mike Vrabel, that's the difference between him and Gerard Mayo last year. That's just the plain and simple difference right there. He's just a better coach. And this team has completely shifted direction. I mean, even yesterday against the Atlanta Falcons, yes, they had a bad game, but that was their worst game by far this year in fantasy football because the Falcons, once again, are a really, really risky play. Now, again, I do think that if you look at the game log here, they've been mostly good against some tough opponents as well. I mean, the Bills one sticks out to you like a sore thumb. 8 points in that game against the Bills offense, that's incredible. So then you look at their week 15 through 17 schedule, they've got teams like the Buffalo Bills at home in this one. Again, if you look at that first game, I don't think that they're going to beat the Bills again in this one, but they could. So this may end up being an okay matchup. Then they go to Baltimore. That's one I want to stay away from. I would rather stay away from that one more than I'd rather stay away from the Buffalo one, which is a division matchup in New England. Going to Baltimore, I don't like that matchup. I would want to get off that one. But then they go to the Jets. And I don't care if that's a division game. Dysfunction can't be fixed. That matchup, that championship matchup, which I value more than any other matchup in the fantasy playoffs, is a lock. It's cake. That's one you want in on. The Patriots defense will be top 10 for the fantasy playoffs for that reason alone, even if the Bills game is a disaster. This defense has been, for the most part, very good. I like the Colts defense. I love Lou Anarumo as that defensive coordinator. I'm very complimentary of that defense for basically the entirety of the season. Through 9 games, 26 sacks, 10 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles, 3 fumbles recovered, and a defensive touchdown. If you take out that Steelers game, they've done really well. Actually, the Broncos game was worse than the Steelers game because they were able to get after Rodgers 3 times. They got 3 sacks on Aaron Rodgers, and they got a fumble recovery as well. So again, even in these losses, they've done really well from a fantasy perspective because they're making the plays necessary. I do think that the Colts defense is just one that you kind of have to factor in with all their talent and the defensive coordinator, Lou Anarumo, as a good defense for fantasy football purposes. Then, of course, you look at the schedule. Again, not a ton of favorable matchups. At Seattle, that one is not going to be a great one. In Seattle, that's one of the toughest places to play. And again, I think if Daniel Jones looks anything like he did against the Steelers, that could be a bad day because he'll put a ton of pressure on that defense. Then they go back home for the next 2 games versus San Fran, who have been able to put up points. And maybe by that time, they'll have Ricky Pearsall back and Brock Purdy back. I don't love that matchup on the surface. But again, I view the Jags matchup in the championship game as a lock. I like the defense. I love the matchup in the championship. And I do think there's some potential wins here with the 49ers in particular. That's a wild card. They could be a top 5 play if they end up doing well against the 49ers, but I don't trust that one as much. The Rams defense is at 10 to round out this tier, and the Rams defense has been awesome too. The Rams defense for fantasy, number 5 defense in fantasy football, 27 sacks through 8 games. That's really good. That's more than 3 sacks per game, 5 interceptions, 8 forced fumbles, 6 fumble recoveries. This has been a really dominant, particularly front 7. And they've made a couple moves to strengthen up that defensive backfield. But really the power here with that defense has been on the front 7. I think the Rams defense has been absolutely fantastic for the most of the fantasy season. Their past 3 games alone, 17 points against the Ravens, 11 points against the Jags, and then they come off the bye week and put up 9 points against the New Orleans Saints. They've done very well. Now, the Rams do have a couple tough ones, potentially in the playoffs. Versus Detroit, that's a matchup I don't love, but I will say Detroit's been a little weird this year offensively without Ben Johnson. They have some bad games, but they can still put up a lot of points with all the talent. So I would definitely lean away from this one. But being in Los Angeles, that could be a sneaky decent one. At Seattle, again, on the surface, that doesn't sound great. It's a divisional matchup. Those can get really weird, especially in the NFC West with 2 strong defenses. Seattle's offense has been lights out, but Los Angeles Rams defense has been pretty close to lights out as well. And at the Atlanta Falcons, that is a really wild card-ish type of matchup. Maybe the Falcons are still fighting for playoff seeding, but I think by that time, the Falcons will be out of the playoff race because they are a 5-loss team now. And I just think the Rams are a better team. So I think that the Rams defense, their talent mostly keeps them in the top 10. And I think that when you look at the last tier, it'll make more sense. So going down to our last tier, the Lions are at 11. And the Lions defense is very scary to play. I mean, I just had them as a top 5 defense this past week against the Vikings. That didn't work out too well. I mean, the Lions defense has been so hot and cold. And again, I've highlighted this sometimes over the past couple of weeks. Their defense is starting to look a lot like the defense from the prior year. I mean, they have tons of injuries. Now, hopefully, they get some guys back for the playoff stretch for fantasy football. Particularly DJ Reed in that secondary, they need him back. But even when you look at the Vikings matchup yesterday, they gave up 27 to the Vikings. They still had 7 points in fantasy because they got 5 sacks on J.J. McCarthy, and they got an interception on him as well. The Lions defense is very aggressive, and I can see this one working out for fantasy football because they go to Los Angeles to play the Rams. I don't like that matchup. I actually want out of that, but I like the Steelers matchup in Detroit. I think that this is the type of game the Steelers don't do well in offensively. The Lions defense, once again, very aggressive. I can see them having a really good day. And the Steelers offense, they will give up sacks in this game. I think that against the Steelers in Week 16, that's a sneaky good matchup. And then at Minnesota, I'd like to see them give it one more try in Minnesota to see if they lose that one again because they already did well from a fantasy perspective against the Vikings yesterday. I think that they could get them again and just get after J.J. McCarthy once again from a pass rushing perspective. I think the Lions will be a fine defense in the fantasy playoffs. And then the Vikings defense is at number 12 to round out the whole thing. The Vikings defense, I have said this for a long time. Brian Flores is a great defensive coordinator. He is so physical. He is so aggressive. He looks like he could put on pads and go out there and play alongside that defense. That defense's mentality is completely geared by Brian Flores, and that's why they have big games sometimes. They're the number 10 defense in fantasy, 23 sacks through 8 games, 3 interceptions, 9 forced fumbles, 2 defensive touchdowns. That's what this defense can do on a weekly basis. Now, it doesn't always work because the Vikings have been a very untrustworthy team, mostly because of that offense. But I do think that the matchups here, some of them could work out in their favor. At Dallas, that is a very unpredictable one because we saw a good defense go to Dallas a couple weeks ago, and they did really well. The Denver Broncos defense, they ended up shutting down that offense and getting turnovers off of Dak and also getting after him in the pass rush. So I don't really put this one as an unplayable matchup, even though the Cowboys can put up points. At the Giants, by that time, I think their season will be so lost that not even Dart can put up good points against the Vikings defense. Those two matchups right there are critical to the success because the Detroit Lions matchup, I get it, it's a divisional game. They can get weird like they did yesterday, but I don't love that one as much as I love the Giants matchup and the Cowboys matchup. I think the Vikings defense will have enough good games to be a top 12 play in the fantasy playoffs. So let me know what you think of the rankings in the comments below, and make sure to stay tuned for tomorrow's defense ranking and kicker rankings for Week 10 fantasy football.